Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ayman Nazir and welcome to Knowledge Realm. So students, we are studying International Relations Part 1 for CSS examination, and the topic that we're going to cover today is first great debate of IR, that is realism versus idealism. So without even wasting a single second, let's get started. Students, before going into the detail of this topic, that is first great debate, I think first we should make a base, a foundation to understand this topic very well. First, we should understand the historical perspective and what was happening in the world at the time that led to a point that the scholars of realism and idealism started arguing with each other and they started this debate. What was happening in the world at the time? I think first we should understand all the history. So starting with the classical realism, we have studied classical realism in detail in the previous lectures. That classical realism is a timeless and the ancient theory, a very old theory, and this is the most dominant theory of IR. We have studied the view of Thucydides and Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. All these scholars are of ancient time, and their main assumption was that human nature is selfish, human nature is greedy of gain, and Thomas Hobbes believes that human is driven by diffidence, glory, and gain. And this was the main assumption of classical realism. We have studied this in detail. And no one knows the origin of classical realism, but this is the theory that has been in existence since the existence of human. Then students, in the Enlightenment era, liberalism was born, and John Locke was the proponent of liberalism. The scholars of liberalism, they gave this concept that there is nothing like selfishness of human nature. Human is not selfish, human is altruistic, human is good, and the military government, the unrepresentative rulers are selfish. And the thing that is wrong, these people are actually wrong, and the local people are not. There is nothing wrong with the human nature, and the local people are not wrong. Actually, the unrepresentative rulers and the aristocracy and the authoritative regimes, these things are wrong. So there should be no such government. And they gave this concept of social contract theory. They gave this that there should be a social contract between the government and the governed, and the government should rule the governed only with the consent of the government. I mean, if I agree to the government of a person, then that person would have a legitimate right to govern me, and there should be a social contract between government and the governed. And this was the main argument of the scholars of liberalism. They say that the government should ensure the liberty of the people, the security of their life, property, and liberty, and if they fail to do so, the people have the right to overthrow the government. This was the main argument of liberalism, and John Locke was the main proponent of liberalism. They say that no, there is nothing wrong with the human nature, and all this classical realism theory is wrong, and their assumption is wrong. That human nature is selfish, and human nature is driven by gain and glory and everything. So they said that no, this is not true, this is wrong. All right, so in 16th and 17th century, in Enlightenment era, liberalism was born. Then students, in 1914, the military powers like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Britain, the France, the Russia, USSR, all these powers collectively waged World War I. All right, the world saw a series of horrific events, and people witnessed World War I. There were desires of military expansion, there were alliances, and all these powers were trying to balance each other, and all these powers were trying to achieve their interest, and they wanted to expand their influence, they wanted to expand their territory, and these powers, they fought World War I. We will study this in International Relations Part 2, but here just keep this thing in mind that World War I happened in 1914. Then students, after World War I, and we have studied this thing in the lecture where we studied the birth of idealism, that after World War I, idealism was born. Idealism was a theory, and the proponent of idealism was Woodrow Wilson. This theory was actually given to eradicate the menace of war from world. Woodrow Wilson gave 14 points, and these scholars of idealism, they actually tried to give a system to the world that could eradicate the menace of war from the world, because World War I was actually an unprecedented war. It was a horrific war, and 15 million people died in World War I. So all these scholars, they got united, and they started thinking that how we can eradicate the menace of war from the world. So they came up with this concept, the theory idealism. And remember this, that idealism was actually based on liberalism of Enlightenment era. Woodrow Wilson said that there should be cooperation, there should be international organizations, there should be the right of self-determination, the liberty of people, and no persecution of people. And he gave these things, these points, and he called these points 14 points. But he just gave this concept, and all the scholars of idealism, they gave this concept that there should be this kind of system, there should be cooperation, there should be international organization to eradicate the menace of war from world, because war does not bring any good to people or to world. War brings destruction, death, and misery. Alright, so this was the birth of idealism in 1918 by Woodrow Wilson, and all the other, I don't remember the names of the people. David Davis was a person who gave us £20,000 for the establishment of IR professorship in the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth. He gave some money so that there could be initiation of the IR professorship, and then the world witnessed the birth of international relations, the subject, and then the birth of idealism. And we have studied this in the previous lecture where we studied the birth of international relations. Then student, the scholars of idealism, they came up with such a fantastic, amazing system, that is idealism, that is cooperation, international law, international organizations. And all this was to eradicate the menace of war from world. This was the main aim of idealism. But idealism could not achieve the goal. Idealism failed, and from 1919 to 1939, world witnessed several kinds of crises, which proved that idealism is a failure. Idealism could not prevent the waging of war in the world. Germany waged Second World War in 1939. League of Nations was dissolved on April 19, 1946. There were economic crises, there were political crises, there were social crises, all kind of crises. So idealism ultimately failed, and idealism could not prevent the initiation of all these crises. Idealism failed. And all the crises of the time, all the crises proved this, that idealism is a failure. Then students, this failure of idealism gave opportunity to the scholars of classical realism, that they once again they came to the front and they criticized idealism. This was the revival of classical realism. This was, students, this was the revival of classical realism. We have studied the classical realism. Classical realism is a timeless theory, and its origin is in history, in ancient history. Here we have studied its origin. No one knows how it originated. The scholars of the time, scholars of 1930s, they just studied that in history something like this existed. Thucydides' view was realist, Niccolo Machiavelli's view was realist, and Thomas Hobsbawm's view was also realist. So the scholars of classical realism of 20th century, they drew their assumptions on the view of these people. All right, so they they drew their assumption on the view of these people, Thucydides, and with the help of this, they criticized idealists. With the help of this, all these people who propounded this theory, classical realism, they criticized idealism. They say that no, idealism is wrong, idealism is failed, and they criticized idealism. Students, this thing started a great debate, and we know this with the name of First Great Debate of IR, and this was a debate between realist scholars and idealist scholars. And all this happened in the 20 years, that is 1919 to 1939, because during this time the world witnessed several kinds of crisis. So this was the historical perspective. I hope that all of you now understand very well that how this debate started and what was happening before this debate in the world, and why realist scholars started criticizing idealist scholars, and from there these realist scholars got these assumptions. These realist scholars got these assumptions from the classical realism, from these Thucydides, Niccolo Machiavelli, and Thomas Hobbes. Now we would study the main arguments of the scholars of realism. So students, before studying the main arguments of the realist scholars of First Great Debate, I think first we should study the crisis of 20 years, that is 1919 to 1939. What were the crises the world was facing at the time that proved that yes, idealism is a failure, and that gave impetus to the scholars of realism to start this debate and to criticize these scholars of idealism. So the first crisis that the people were facing in the world at the time was economic crisis. We will study that in 1929 world faced Great Depression, the stock market of USA crashed, and after that students, this thing caused a ripple effect on the economy of the world, and after that people faced inflation, unemployment, poverty in Germany and Italy, and all the Europe was the economic crisis grappled all the Europe, and in fact all the world. So due to economic crisis, people lost faith in idealism, and people believed that this idealism is nothing, and it did not do any good to us, so it's a failure. Then students, there were political crises. We all know that in 1917 there was a communist revolution in Russia, and no one was ready to accept that okay, now we should adopt democracy, we should embrace democracy. There was communist revolution in Russia 1917, there was socialism and fascism in Italy and Germany. Hitler took charge of Germany, and Benito Mussolini, he became dictator in Italy. These people rejected democracy. Democracy was actually the ideology of idealism, and but these people, due to economic crisis, they believed that there is economic crisis in the world, and idealism is a failure. So these people, due to economic crisis, fell for socialism and fascism, because idealism could not deliver, idealism failed to deliver, idealism could not prevent these economic crises. So these countries like Germany and Italy, they fell for socialism and fascism. Then these dictators actually they exploited the economic crisis, because there were economic crisis. So they made people believe that idealism is useless, and idealism is a failure. So due to economic crisis, there were political crisis. All right, and there was socialism and fascism. Then students, the League of Nations, that was the international organization, and that was proposed by Woodrow Wilson, it failed. It could not prevent the authoritative acts of states, it could not prevent the expansion of states and the invasions of states. And in 1935 Ethiopia was invaded by Italy. League of Nations could not prevent that invasion. In 1931 Japan very ruthlessly invaded Manchuria. Then students, in 1946, League of Nations was dissolved. It could not prevent these crises. But this was the job of League of Nations. I mean, League of Nations was established for this purpose, that League of Nations would prevent the lawlessness in the world, but it could not do so because states were very strong at the time. International organizations are actually strong only when states decide to make them strong. The main powerful actor in the world is a state. So at that time, states were not interested in making League of Nations strong. There was no such intentions, and League of Nations failed because states were not with this organization. So all the ideas of Woodrow Wilson and all the ideas of other idealist scholars failed, and there were crises in the world, and people lost their trust in idealism. So this failure of idealism led to the first great debate of Aya. Now students, let's see the view of a realist scholar who criticized idealism. E. H. Carr, Edward Hallett Carr, he was a realist, and after the failure of idealism, he criticized idealism in his work The 20 Years Crisis, 1919 to 1939. This was the book that E. H. Carr wrote, and in this book he criticized idealism. He actually identified the loopholes in idealism. He said that idealism actually did not understand the international structure, it just idealized the international structure. He said that scholars' job is to understand the facts and not idealize the system. He was of the view that all the idealist scholars, they just neglected all the harsh realities of the world, that states are not so moral, states are not interested in moral principles, states are just interested in their survival, in their benefit, and in their good, and they are just interested in their interest. So E. H. Carr was of the view that idealist scholars, they just ignored everything. They ignored the realities of international structure, and they gave a very utopian approach. This was the word that he used, that their approach is utopian, and they just created a utopia in their mind that okay, now we would implement the democracy in the world, and there would be cooperation, and there would be international organization, international law, but they did not look deep into the realities of the world. They did not try to understand human, as realism say that human nature is selfish. They did not understand human nature. They did not understand the nature of the states. They just idealized the international structure. Then he said that these idealist scholars, they formed international institutions like League of Nations, but they ignored the power of a state. And students, realist scholars believe that the most powerful actor in the world is a state. It's not international institutions, but it's a state. State can do whatever it wants in the world, and international institutions exist only with the consent of states. But the principal actor in the world is a state and not the international institutions. So at that time, states like Germany, Japan, Italy, and Russia, these states were not interested in League of Nations because League of Nations was not serving their interest. These states were authoritative at the time, and they were just interested in their own survival, in their own benefit. And because idealism could not deliver, idealism could not fulfill their interests, there were economic crises, there were political crises, idealism failed, and these states became authoritative, and they started fighting again. They waged Second World War. So he said that idealism is a utopia and not based on facts, because these scholars did not attempt to understand the international structure, the human nature, and the nature of the state. So this was the main view of E. H. Carr. He criticized idealism, and he gave all this view. This is all the summary, I would say, the crux of his book, The 20 Years Crisis. Now students, let's compare the views of realist scholars and idealist scholars. First of all, idealist scholars focused on the reformation of the international politics after the end of World War One. They gave this democratic peace theory, and they said that there would be cooperation, states would cooperate, and right of self-determination, there should be liberty of people, and the nations do have the right of self-determination. They reserve the right of self-determination, and they should be given their own states, and all these things. The idealist scholars gave all these things. But realist scholars, they actually focused on the harsh realities of the world. They focused on the selfish nature of humans, greed for power, and all the expansionary desires. And if we study history, we would realize that this is truth. This is the thing that was happening in the world at the time. I mean, what were the desires of Hitler? Hitler wanted expansion of Germany. He wanted to establish a German empire, a very, very expanded German empire for 1,000 years. This was the view and the dream of Hitler. So realist scholars actually focused on all the harsh realities of the world, but idealist scholars, they did not. They just focused on the reformation of international politics. They said that okay, now we would reform the international politics, but they did not focus on the harsh realities and the problems and all the hurdles of international politics. All right. Number two, idealist scholars, they give a utopia. Utopians idealized everything without understanding. Realist scholars call these idealist scholars utopians, and they argue that utopians idealized everything without understanding. But realist scholars are concerned with understanding the actions of states. They say that we should understand the actions of states, and we should not just create a utopia and try to reform the international politics, and we should not just idealize things, but we should understand the actions of the states. If states are fighting, why states are fighting, we should understand these things. Then idealist scholars, they establish international institutions to end the anarchy in the international system, like League of Nations. They established these institutions. But realist scholars gave importance to the state as the main and unitary actor of the world. I have explained it several times in this lecture that international institutions exist only with the consent of these states. And at that time, most of the states of the Europe, they were not interested in these international institutions. So realist scholars believe that the most powerful actor in the world is a state, and the international institution an international institution would exist only if the states are interested in the international institution. At that time, in 1919, US did not join League of Nations, and Germany and Japan also withdrew from United Nations, not United Nations, I mean League of Nations. Sorry, I used the wrong word. US did not join League of Nations, but Germany and Japan, they also, both the countries withdrew from League of Nations in 1933. So these states were not interested in international institutions at the time. So international institution could not remain established and could not work on its own. It needed the support of the states, because who run international institution? It's the states. So states at the time were not interested in international institutions. So they just quit from these international institutions. They withdrew, and international institution at the time was dismembered. Then another point that that the realists give about the idealism, that these idealist scholars pacified the status quo and alienated the revisionist power that infuriated them. This is the reason that Germany waged Second World War, because Germany faced injustices. All right. So realist scholars actually gave importance to the actions of states. But what idealists did, they just specified the status quo and alienated the revisionist power, and they just idealized everything, and they said that okay, now there would be cooperation and international institutions and these things. But realists, they were interested in the actions of a state. They focused that if Germany waged war, why it waged war, what was wrong with the Treaty of Versailles, and what were the injustices to Germany. We will study this thing when we study the World War One, that actually there were injustices to Germany. In Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept all the humiliation for the World War One and war reparations. Germany was forced to pay war reparations. So there was these injustices to Germany, and realist scholars actually give importance to these things, but idealists, they did not. They just idealized and they pacified the status quo and alienated the revisionist power. So students, this was the comparison of realism and idealism. These were the points given by realist scholars in the first great debate of IR, that was between realism and idealism. And what was the conclusion of this debate? Well, realist scholars won this debate because they gave very strong arguments, and all the situation of the world at that time. The world had witnessed World War II and several types of crisis. So all the arguments of realist scholars were actually justified, and it were the all the situation of the world proved this, that yes, realists are correct here, and idealism was a failure. So idealist scholar was at the back foot in 1945 when not in 1945, in 1939 when the Second World War was waged. But realist scholars, they won this great debate. All right, so this is the end of this lecture. I hope I have explained everything in detail, and I hope that everything makes sense now. What was first great debate? In the next lecture, inshallah, we would study the behavioral approach and the system theory. We would study the second great debate, and I would try to make that I would try to upload that lecture as soon as possible. So till then, thank you. Allah Hafiz. Don't forget to like this video, comment on this video, and share any knowledge if you have, because I love to read knowledge. And don't forget to subscribe the channel. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.